One genre of anime that's pretty popular right now is the Isekai or otherworld genre. The general premise of a character being sent to another world and having to deal with that world with all its fantasy elements and superpowers, and that character becoming somewhere important to that other world is pretty damn common these days. Similarly, light novel adaptations are also on the rise, and they also have a certain controversial cachet to them. And if I were to tell you that today I was going to be talking about a series that's an isekai series that was based off of a light novel, I know what sort of thoughts I'd be having, and I'm pretty sure I know what sort of thoughts you'd be having. But this isn't that sort of show. For sure, it is that. It is an isekai series, it is based off of a light novel adaptation, but it's not a new one. The anime first aired in 2002, and the light novels are a full decade older than that, meaning that this series existed long before any of the traits and tropes we currently associate with the genre. If you're wondering if that's even possible, well, here's my answer. Welcome one and all, this is Corey Understone, and today I bring you a review of the 12 Kingdoms. We open with our Japanese high school protagonist Yoko getting sucked into another world. Wow, never seen that plotline before. Ever. Not ever. But, right from the get-go, 12 Kingdoms does 4 things differently that had me really intrigued. First off, Yoko doesn't get sucked into another world. She doesn't step outside, blink, and end up in another world. She doesn't fall down a well. She doesn't fall into a book. No. A guy from another world who calls himself Keiki literally shows up in Yoko's classroom and basically abducts her. So that just caught my attention right off the bat as something so straightforward that I hadn't seen it before. Also, it raised a lot of questions. First off, if Keiki was able to come to our world, then does that mean the people in this other world know about our world? Is travel back and forth between them possible? Why did Keiki come to get Yoko? What's the connection there? But the big thing, again, was the idea that this other world knew our world existed. That just fascinated me. Additionally, Keiki isn't the only one who can cross between worlds, as we see a few minutes later when these demon bird things, the Yoma, come crashing into Yoko's classroom. The second thing is that Yoko isn't the only person to go to this other world. I mean, she doesn't go alone. Sure, Keiki came to get her and all, but she doesn't end up going back with just him. She's rather accompanied by her friends, and I say that in the loosest terminology possible, Asano and Sugimoto. So on one hand, the story is telling us that Yoko is super special because this guy came all the way from another world to come get her. On the other hand, the story is telling us she's not special at all, in that these 2 other people were also able to cross between the worlds. It's not just her. That not just her thing is actually the 4th thing on the list, but I'll get there in a minute. For now, the 3rd thing that made me really notice the 12 Kingdoms as something different was the way in which it presents its world. We don't actually get to the other world until episode 2. Most of episode 1 is spent in our world, just sort of getting a feel for who Yoko is and what her life is like, but from what we see right off the bat, the world looks cold, bleak, and unalluring. The characters are stranded in this wasteland, from the monsters to the alien sea, to the twisted and warped trees. It's a landscape far more indicative of horror than it is of escapist fantasy. It's not a series that's trying to make you fall in love with its world, and that's a calculated ploy. On one hand, you risk alienating watchers because if they don't fall in love with the world, they're not going to want to go there and not want to escape there, and that loses you the escapist fantasy market. On the other hand, it does something much more important. It gets you inside the characters' heads. The landscapes make you weary and uncomfortable, and that's exactly how our protagonists are feeling, lost in this strange, isolated alien world. The 4th thing is, as I mentioned before, in many regards Yoko isn't special, which is pretty damn awesome. She is not the first person to come to this world, not even close. Everyone in that world knows that Japan, which they call Horai, exists, and that is the place where the Keikyaku come from. Keikyaku is their word for the people who come to their world from ours. They even have a word for it, which is pretty cool. Heck, this show has a whole lot of vocabulary, and while it's pretty touch and go figuring it out at first, it actually in the end adds a ton to the world building. You slowly start to pick up words and terms until by the end, words like Taika, Kirin, and Sennin all make perfect sense. The world building is great in this show, and I want to talk about that, and I will in a minute, but for right now I actually want to go back to the very beginning because there's one other thing that the 12 Kingdoms does differently right off the bat, and that's something I love. It's this first opening scene. It's this incredibly creepy, trippy scene with this laughing monkey talking to someone called Sekishi while seeming to taunt and threaten them. This scene turns out to be nothing more than a dream that our protagonist Yoko is having, but like the trippy dream that opens Madoka Magica, it sets the tone and is a lot more than it seems. After that dream scene, it's hard not to look at everything that follows as ominous, threatening, and the calm before the storm. And not only does that add to its enjoyment, but that's exactly how you should be viewing it because the 12 Kingdoms is, at its heart, especially in the first 2 arcs, a psychological horror anime. We spend a lot of time in the headspace of our main characters and watch as they become more and more twisted by the events of the story. We also watch the way in which those events and the twisting of one person's mind can affect the people around them. I love this cast. First off, we have Yoko, protagonist of arcs 1 and 3. Yoko is, while she's not the best protagonist I've ever seen, she's pretty good. She's an enjoyable character who I liked watching grow over the course of her screen time. She starts out as someone who really isn't connected to anyone or anything around her because she's working so hard to be liked by everyone that she stops doing anything that she likes or acting in a way that she likes. She doesn't even like herself all that much. It's so interesting to watch the way that doubts creep into her over the course of the series and watch her outgrow some of them and embrace others. She develops a lot, both in her first and in her second arc, and I really enjoyed having her on screen. I also, however, enjoyed the fact that she wasn't the protagonist of all of the arcs. I liked the fact that the story was able to move away from her and explore more of this world, especially when that gave us the protagonists of arcs 2 and 4. Arc 2 is the story of this kid, Taiki, who I honestly think is an even better main character. He's this kid who's thrust into an impossible situation, having to make choices that will affect thousands of people, and while he's trying to do what's best, he feels like he's not adequate. His feelings of inadequacy and his struggle with his choice are incredibly heart-wrenching to watch, especially because he's just so sweet and kind and likable. He's a lot like Arslan from the Heroic Legend of Arslan that way. The sort of character you just want to get behind and just sort of want to pat on the shoulder and tell they're going to be okay. But this is the 12 Kingdoms, and this arc is psychological horror, so you know it's not going to be okay because juxtaposed with these moments of Taiki trying to figure his life out, you get flashes of present-day Taiki. See, the arc takes place mostly in backstory, while current-day flashes show someone who is so totally different from Taiki as we knew him, and who's in such an incredibly dark place that you wonder what the hell possibly happened. Where did it all go so badly wrong that he ended up like this? And you want to know the answer, which is a real shame because you're never going to find out because the 12 Kingdoms didn't animate all of the books, and so Taiki's story, which by the way is the only one that is not self-contained, is the only one that they didn't fully animate, which is sort of their fault, but not entirely. See, the book that next follows Taiki, The Shore at Twilight, is out and was out at the time of the anime. But The Shore in Twilight doesn't finish the story. So Taiki's story is unfinished even to this day, which really ticks me off. That said, the arc itself is still quite enjoyable and I still definitely recommend it because it is probably my favorite in the 12 Kingdoms, although Arc 3 could definitely give it a run for its money in terms of just general awesomeness. Arc 3 brings Yoko back as the protagonist and introduces 2 other main characters, Suzu and Shoke, who both go through their own journeys over the course of the narrative and are both quite enjoyable, although I still think I liked Yoko best of all, if only because I think she got more development and a more badass scene to round out her arc. The final arc was another standalone story about 2 of my favorite characters from the series overall, Enki and Shoryu, who have been showing up in all of the other arcs, and so I was really happy when they got an arc of their own. They're one of those anime duos that are just incredibly fun to watch. Between their banter and their sarcasm and the way they fight back and forth, they're just highly entertaining, and so watching this story was incredibly enjoyable for me. I also want to go back to Season 1 and mention Yoko's two friends, Asano and Sugimoto, and the walking plot device that is Rakashun. Asano starts out as Yoko's childhood friend and is pretty generic, but this series forces him into such situations that he is not allowed to continue being generic, which I think is pretty cool. And the way his story evolves is just really twisted, which again I found highly enjoyable. Sugimoto starts out as the more obviously twisted character, a social reject who is desperately yearning for another world and follows Yoko because she's convinced that this world is built specifically for her. It isn't, and her dealing with that and having to come to terms with that also twists and warps her character in ways that are also very enjoyable to watch. Speaking of the world, at the end of the day, that's what makes the 12 Kingdoms work. It is an incredibly well-realized world. It is an incredibly well-developed and well-built world, and one I really, really enjoyed. The rules for so many things are so incredibly different from our world, from childbirth, which isn't a thing because children are born from fruit on trees, to how a king is chosen, to the laws governing inter-kingdom relations and policies, to what happens when a king dies and how badly wrong that can go, as well as how right it can go, to even the divine and the foundation of the world sorts of myths. It's an incredibly fascinating world, one you will lose yourself in, and the horror aspects actually add to its appeal because it feels more real and a lot less like an idealized fantasy. Now I realize that I'm about 12 minutes into the video and still haven't touched on plot, but there's a reason for that. The reason is that the plot of the first arc is, well, basically a spoiler. You don't know what the plot is for most of the arc. You're just watching Yoko and her companions running around desperately trying to survive and being driven more and more mad by what they're being forced to go through. You don't know why it's happening, you don't know what's going on, you don't know much about the world, but neither do they. It's really enjoyable to watch, especially since you're learning alongside them, putting you and the characters in a very similar place when it comes to this new world. And the badass fight scenes will come. You do get a lot of cool military stuff and battles in later arcs, so if that's what you're down for, then totally hang around for that. Now, the 12 Kingdoms doesn't do as much of that as a show like, say, Kingdom or The Heroic Legend of Arslan, but it's still in there. It's just not the primary center of the show because that's not what the show's about. It's about the psychological, not the physical. Animation-wise, while the animation is old, it's still very strong. The show presents us with a lot of incredibly visceral images, like that foreign sea that Yoko looks at in episode 2. The rippling pool where the monkey that torments Yoko sits with all its shading and shadows and masks. And probably the most visceral image of the show, a unicorn collapsing into a puddle of blood, all of which do a lot to add to the horror aspects of the anime. To sum up, The 12 Kingdoms is the antithesis of the stock standard light novel Isekai series because it is incredibly creative with an incredibly well fleshed out, well realized world, and some characters who are horribly flawed in ways that are incredibly enjoyable to watch. And it is for that reason that I give The 12 Kingdoms a 5 out of 5 stars, as it is now one of my favorite fantasy anime ever. As for alternate anime recommendations, if you're looking for another psychological horror anime, I'm actually going to point you toward one that is technically sci-fi rather than fantasy, but has a lot of the same aspects, and that is Shinsekai Yori or From the New World. If you are looking for another fantasy anime, then I point you toward another character-based, world-building fantasy anime, Moribito Guardian of the Spirit. And finally, if you are interested in a fantasy show with a fully realized government and world, but with a few more battles and more tactics involved, I'm going to point you toward a show I referenced earlier, Kingdom. And if you want to know more about Kingdom, I suggest you check out my review of it, links in the description. Otherwise, please like and subscribe and let me know what you think down in the comments. If you hadn't noticed, I'm on a bit of a medieval fantasy streak right now, so if there are any other medieval fantasy or historic fantasy animes you think I should check out, please let me know, and please let me know if there's anything else you want to see me reviewing. This is Coriander Stone, and I thank you for watching.